Hi, I'm Chad. I write documentation here for Customer IO, and today I'm going to show you how to set up our Salesforce source integration so that you can bring data into Customer IO from Salesforce and use it to trigger campaigns, message your contacts, follow up with leads, and so on. So as you can see, I'm starting with a fresh workspace, and that's just so that it's easy for us to demonstrate this integration. You don't need to create a new workspace to integrate with Salesforce. So to get started, we'll go to Data Pipelines, go to Sources, click Add Source, and select Salesforce. Now in this first step, I'm going to add my credentials. I'm in a sandbox environment, so I'm going to turn that on and enter my credentials. Now, if you get an error logging in, it might be that you're trying to use sandbox credentials against a production environment or production credentials against the sandbox environment. That's an error that we've seen occasionally. So if you get a little red box here, that might be why. But we didn't get an error, so we're ready to move on to the next step and create our first sync. Now, a sync is a type of data that you want to bring into Customer IO from Salesforce on a regular interval. And we support all of the types of data that you've got in your Salesforce environment. So that's all of the default data types like accounts, contacts, and leads, but also any custom data that you might have, which might be a lot of data. So you only want to create syncs for the kinds of data that you want to use in Customer IO. And we're going to start with contacts because they're one of the most common things to sync and they map easily to people. So there are a few things to pay attention to here. First, we're going to start with fields to sync. Now, the fields to sync, or the contact sync details, are details from Salesforce that you want to map to attributes in Customer IO. So in this case, we're taking data from contacts, like the last name, first name, and things like that. And we are saying that we want to bring those in as attributes to set on people in Customer IO. Now, again, you might have a lot of data here. This probably isn't all useful. Like, for example, I don't really know what a master record ID is or how I would use that in Customer IO, so I'm not going to bring that in. But I might care about a mailing address and phone numbers and email for sure, title, department, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to bring that information in. Next up, we've got the unique identifier. Now, this is the value. What we're saying here is we're going to map a value from Salesforce to a unique identifier for a person in Customer IO. So in this case, we're saying we're taking the contact ID, the value that represents a unique contact in Salesforce, and mapping it to an ID in Customer IO. And we try to set the unique identifier field automatically for several different types of data that you can sync to Customer IO. And most of the time, you can go with the default. But you might want to change this if you already bring in people using a different ID value. So say, for example, you identify people on your website by one ID, and then you want to bring in contacts. If you bring in contacts with a contact ID, but you already identify people from a different ID in your website, there's a chance you can end up with duplicate entries that represent the same real person. So if you already use a different value to represent people in Customer IO, you might want to change this to email, which you can do. But we're in a fresh workspace, so we are going to stick with contact ID. That will work for us. Now, next up, you've got the sync frequency. This is how often you're going to sync data, in this case, contacts, to Customer IO. Now, the first sync brings in all of your contacts, and then subsequent syncs will bring in the change set. So the first sync brings in everything, and the next set just brings in data that changed since the previous sync. By default, we set this as an hour. You can sync down to every minute, but keep in mind that your workspace does things other than syncing your Salesforce data. It also has to process campaigns and trigger messages, and maybe even process data from other integrations. So if you have an especially active Salesforce environment and you're trying to sync data down to every minute, there's a chance you could slow down your workspace. So just try to keep this frequency to something that's reasonable for you, that's on a comfortable schedule. If you notice things slowing down, just know that you may need to change your sync frequency. It's not something we've seen very often, but in stress tests, it's something we've experienced. Anyway, we are now set up and we're ready to choose our destination. Now, your destination is where you want to store and use your Salesforce data. Now, in every case, you're going to want to select your Journeys workspace. And that just means that we're going to take data from Salesforce and we're going to store and use it to trigger campaigns, send messages, and stuff in Customer IO Journeys. We're in a fresh workspace, so we don't have other destinations here, but you might if you're in a fully populated workspace. So say, for example, you want to send your Salesforce data to a data warehouse. You could do that. If you wanted to send it to an analytics destination like Mixpanel or Amplitude, you could do that too. But again, in every case, if you want to use your Salesforce data in Customer IO, you're going to select your Journeys workspace. So now we're ready to go and we're ready to enable Salesforce. And we're going to check things out. Now, if I look at imports, we'll see that I'm syncing people. This might take just a minute to show up. We don't have too many people, but if I start refreshing, hey, there we go. We've got people. Now, if I check out Ricardo here, we'll see that I've got some attributes. I've got salutation, first name, last name, email address. Now, I don't have all the attributes, but if I go back and check in Salesforce, we'll notice that, yeah, I don't have a mailing address. So that attribute didn't populate in Customer IO. So there we go. But I do notice that Ricardo is associated with this account called SaaS Testing Bristol, but I don't have accounts in Customer IO. I've got custom objects. So let's bring in accounts. Let's do the next thing. So to do that, I'm going to bring in one other sync. I'm going to add a sync. And in this case, I'm going to bring in accounts. Now, just like contacts, we are going to check out our fields to sync. Like contacts or people in Customer IO, we are going to bring in attributes. Now, in this case, these values are going to map to attributes for an account in Customer IO. So in this case, again, we might have a lot of data. I don't really know what a master record ID is, but I'm going to bring in the things that matter to me, like account name, account type. Let's bring in maybe the billing address. Let's go with the phone number, website, industry, number of employees, maybe a short description for the account, all that good stuff. Bring that in. Now, the unique identifier for an account is set to the account ID. We don't have accounts already, so I don't need to change it to anything. And in most cases, you probably won't need to change it. It's a lot less likely that you're bringing in accounts from multiple sources. So you can probably just leave this as it is. And I'm going to leave the sync frequency at an hour. You can have different frequencies for different types of data, but I don't really see a need for that. So I'm going to leave that at an hour and move on to the next step. And again, I'm going to select my Journeys workspace, but I do have one other step here. So remember how we have custom objects here? That's because Customer IO doesn't have default concepts for things like accounts or opportunities, the discrete pieces of data that Salesforce holds. So we have to tell Customer IO what we want to create. So in this case, we're going to create a new object type called accounts. Now I set the plural and singular forms here. You only have to set both because that helps Customer IO know how to use the plural or singular forms in the UI. So we're going to create an object type called accounts. We're going to save our changes and we're going to enable the sync. And now we see that we're bringing in accounts. And I'm going to start seeing those here pretty soon. They're syncing. But if I go refresh, we'll see that custom objects has become accounts. If I check out my accounts, hey, there we go. Now, if I check out SaaS Testing Bristol, we'll see that I am bringing in some information. I've got the industry, the number of employees, the account name, all that good stuff. Again, I selected the address, but we don't have an address in here. So that didn't populate. But there is one other thing missing. I know that Ricardo is associated with this account, but if I look in Salesforce, if I look in Customer IO, I won't see any relationships. And if I look at Ricardo, I'll also see that Ricardo isn't related to that account. But I know that Ricardo is related to that account from Salesforce. So now I'm going to try and bring in that relationship information to Customer IO. And we're going to do that with one last sync. Now, in the same way that Salesforce keeps accounts and contacts as discrete pieces of information, it also handles relationships that way. So we are going to bring in account, contact, relationships. This means we're bringing in a relationship between accounts and contacts. That's all that means. Now here, unlike contacts and accounts, we do have to do a little bit more setup here because we can't get the default identifier. So under identifiers, we are going to say that the value that maps, that represents a person, we're going to map that to a value that represents an account. So in this case, we're going to pick the contact ID and we're going to map that to an account ID. So we're going to say that for each person by contact ID, we're going to map that to their relevant account. So we're going to save those changes. And then we are going to sync some fields. Now, in the same way that accounts and contacts have their own data, so do relationships. So in this case, let's bring in the role, whether or not it's a direct relationship, whether or not it's active, maybe the relationship strength. Let's get when the relationship started. and we'll save those changes. And again, I'm going to leave the frequency at 1 hour. Now we're ready to configure destinations. One last time, we've got to do this step. What I'm going to do is select account here, and all we're saying is that I'm going to map relationships to accounts here. I'm ready to save my changes. Now I'm going to enable this sync, and we'll see that I'm bringing in relationships. Now this is going to take a minute because we've got to bring in information from 2 different places in Salesforce, accounts and contacts. We're doing some associative work here. So this takes just a little bit longer than the other syncs. So I'm going to pause the video here so you don't have to wait for the sync to finish. All right, we've synced our relationships. Took about 3 minutes. Now, if I go back to Ricardo and refresh, we'll see that he is associated with SaaS Testing Bristol, just like in our Salesforce environment. And if I were to go to, and we'll also see that his attributes have come in. So like it's an active relationship, it's a direct relationship, the creation date for the relationship. And if I go to SaaS Testing Bristol, we'll also see that this is bidirectional. So I can see this relationship no matter where we are. So now we've set up Salesforce to bring in contacts, accounts, and relationships between the 2. And now we can use that information in Customer IO to trigger campaigns. When there's a change to an account, we can also message people associated with that account by relationship. And we're all set up. But we're not necessarily done. You could also add syncs for other types of data that you want to bring in and use in Customer IO. This is just a basic demonstration of one of the default types of data that you can bring in, accounts, contacts, and relationships between the 2. Thanks, everybody.